Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is Fractal Cactus, and we're at it again. Today, talking about another indie game. We're talking about Knuckle Sandwich. Developed by Andy Brophy and published by Superhot, or rather, Superhot Presents. And yes, that's Superhot. It's kind of cool that they've gotten into game publishing, and clearly they're pretty good at it. They've got an eye for it, they've got a knack for it, because Knuckle Sandwich is something special. Now, if you're wondering what Knuckle Sandwich is, yes, Knuckle Sandwich is another in a long line of what we like to call anti-RPGs. If you need further explanation of what an anti-RPG is, it is a game that is developed in the style of Earthbound, aka Mother. You might also be familiar with games like Undertale, Lisa the Painful, and of course everybody's favorite, Yick. Knuckle Sandwich, though, man, Knuckle Sandwich. Listen, I haven't finished it. I'd say about 2.5 hours in, maybe. And within that 2.5 hours, I have to say that I am positively blown away. There is a lot to talk about in this game. The problem is that I really can't talk about a lot of it, even the intro. So what I'll say is that if you think it looks interesting, even just a little bit, you don't even have to listen to me talk about this. I appreciate you coming through, watching the video. Consider liking and subscribing. But there is a demo available on Steam, so check that out. I don't know how far in the demo gets. Maybe the demo won't get to the parts of the game where I started to be like, whoa, this is really interesting. Though, I think the game is almost interesting immediately. The thing that Knuckle Sandwich does is, let's talk about the combat. The combat is very much like Super Mario RPG, but rather, instead of just, pressing A when you're about to hit the enemy and doing more damage, it's more like, what if Super Mario RPG was WarioWare, right? And listen, I've talked on here before in the channel about, like, making comparisons. It's sort of reductive to just break a game down into its most basic parts like that, but you've probably seen game footage of this, and you more than likely understand what it is the developer's trying to do, right? Combat, yeah, there is turn-based combat, and you interact with enemies. There's a little bar at the bottom. You kind of time your most basic attacks like you're playing like a bowling game, like Wii Bowling, or like a golfing game. It's a little bar that goes back and forth, and you try to line it up. There's more nuance to it than that. I'll leave that for you to discover. It's actually kind of in-depth, honestly. Not like super in-depth, but there is depth to even the most basic attack. But outside of that, either when you use a skill or when enemies use skills, the game turns into a very brief mini-game, very much in the style of WarioWare. They're fun, they're quirky. Some of them are styled after, genres like shoot-'em-ups. Some of them are just like, some of them are very basic, like, ooh, golf. You understand that, right? Sometimes you have to, grab an egg. They get pretty interesting. Some of them are definitely more interesting than others, for sure. The thing that's really cool is that when the enemy does their skill, if you manage to avoid the entire attack, the enemy takes damage and you take no damage. So in theory, you could go through fights, like if you're good enough, you could go through fights taking no damage at all, which for a turn-based RPG is a really cool concept. To be able to maybe even potentially do the entire game without taking damage, right? But that's just the combat system. I think, you can see that and sort of ascertain for yourself that that's what the game is trying to do, and whether or not you find that compelling, I think it's really compelling, especially since, Super Mario RPG just got remade. And so you can kind of go back and look at how that whole idea got started, and then look at something like Knuckle Sandwich and see how people have begun to iterate on that and develop that further. And as far as I'm concerned, what Knuckle Sandwich has done is probably the most interesting application of that idea yet. And the other thing that's cool is it's not just tied to the combat. There's actually a number of sequences throughout the game just during the story as you're interacting with characters during more narrative-focused segments. Sometimes the game will just turn into a mini-game really quick, and you have to, just like WarioWare, you have to learn really quickly. Generally, those moments tend to last a little bit longer than the ones in the combat. If a combat mini-game takes, I don't know, 3 seconds, The ones that take place during the story might run you, I don't know, 30 seconds to a minute. And once again, I'm only about 2 hours in, so I haven't seen the full breadth of what the game intends to do. But within that time, I have been compelled. I think it's a really fun way to add flavor and variety to even the downtime of the game, you know, because I don't know, there's been like discussion even recently on Twitter and places like that about like the value of JRPGs or turn-based RPGs, and you know, a lot of developers will resort to things like adding timing to attacks or mini games to try to liven up the genre. And some people feel like that's not necessary, considering that, you know, JRPGs can have fun and depth just in like executing, you know, decision making, you know, what spells to use, what skills to use, when to attack, when to defend, things like that. And I'm totally in argument of that. I think you look at something like Final Fantasy X, I think like that's the apex of turn-based combat in a lot of ways. But I don't mind when games do something like Knuckle Sandwich either, so long as it's done well. I actually, you know, a lot of people have been talking about Sea of Stars recently, and I think that game's okay, but I also think it's kind of overhyped, to be quite honest, and I really don't like to talk about, like, oh, this game's overrated or whatever, but I think it's fine for what it's doing, but I think something like Knuckle Sandwich should be getting way more attention than Sea of Stars. Sea of Stars is very pedestrian. It's very safe. You know, it's very much exactly what you expect. When you look at something and you're being reductive and you're breaking it down into those basic parts, Sea of Stars is like Chrono Trigger and Super Mario RPG. You know, some games are absolutely worthy of that reductive analysis, right? Knuckle Sandwich is a little bit harder to pin down. I think Knuckle Sandwich almost pulls the wool over your eyes. You know, you see trailers for it and you think, oh, I get it. I get what the game's trying to do. And then you play it for a little bit. Like I said, I don't want to spoil anything. I really just want people to play and experience this game for themselves. But there's a few points really on in the game where I was like, oh, it's going to do that. Yeah, you could look at it and see the Earthbound influence and the Undertale influence, certainly. But the one influence I don't think a lot of people are going to peg is the Grasshopper manufacturer influence, Suda51, right? I picked up on it, not want to say immediately, but there's a few moments early in the game where I was like, you know, this has that sort of dark, biting cynicism that you see in something like No More Heroes and Killer 7. I know I just talked about Killer 7 a lot in my last video, though this is more No More Heroes than Killer 7 for sure. But I was like, oh wow, is he channeling some Suda51 here? And then there's a few moments in the game. There's a character that's like a goblin that you like joins your ranks fairly early on. You see some footage in it in here. And after the goblin joins your party, it does something where I was like, okay, yeah, no, he's absolutely channeling No More Heroes, or at least Suda or Grasshopper. It's that darkness despite the colorful aesthetic. Like, all right, once again, I don't want to spoil anything, but the reason that the game is called Knuckle Sandwich, there's a reason for that. And knowing that, playing through those segments, I mean, I was like, this game is going to be amazing. I cannot wait to see where it goes from here. I tried really hard to not include anything substantial in terms of spoilers. Everything you're seeing here is the first time that the game kind of lets you walk around and fight enemies. It's like, I guess you could call it like the first dungeon. There's some puzzles. There's, you know, the combat encounters. You see they're on the map. They're not random combat encounters. So it's after the game's intro, which is also super interesting. And in a part of the game I would consider the downtime, but like right after some of the big story moments. And they're significant. So I'll leave you to it. There's my phone. I'll leave you to it. I'm not re-recording this. I'll leave you to it to discover for yourself, right? It is very special. People are absolutely going to be making, you know, video essays about this in time. I've already seen some people covering it and making videos about it, and it's the typical, oh, it's like Earthbound, another Earthbound-inspired RPG. I'm waiting. I'm putting this video out early. I haven't gotten too far into the game myself. Maybe if I continue to like it as much as I currently do, once I'm finished it, I'll put out a more spoiler-heavy video. But for right now, I just want to say, stop everything you're doing. Check out Knuckle Sandwich. If you got to download the demo, fine. The game's only $20. Absolutely worth that ticket price. This is going to be in the upper echelon of anti-RPGs for sure. Anyway, I'm Fractal Cactus. Consider liking, consider subscribing. It really helps me out. I hope to see you in the next video. Take care.